Genre names are pretty confusing. Emo, Screamo, Epic Doom, Nerdcore, Futuristic Swag. It's hard to get your head around all these terms, let alone begin to understand what style of music each of these genres actually define. This overcrowded mountain of phrases and niche terminologies, with sweaty gatekeepers protecting the definitions of both, becomes even harder to climb when you find two terms that appear to mean the exact same thing, although are occasionally used in completely different contexts. These two words are Screamo and Skramz, with the most common of the two being Screamo. Although both words are supposed to mean the same thing, Screamo has been subject to years of confusion due to definition changes sparked on by mainstream meddling in the early 2000s. For most mainstream listeners, Screamo just refers to any style of music that features screaming, most commonly being used to refer to the popular side of post-hardcore that just so happened to feature some screaming in the early 2000s. Thing is, prior to this genre's push into the mainstream, Screamo meant something completely different, referring to a chaotic, frantic, almost unlistenable brand of hardcore that was birthed out of San Diego in the early 90s. So if Screamo means various different things, what does Skramz mean? This is where we run into an issue. Skramz means essentially the exact same thing, and is used to describe the exact same music birthed out of the exact same San Diego scene. So why do we need two terms to describe the exact same style of music? And more importantly, why did the definition of Screamo become so diluted due to mainstream attention that it came to define a completely different style of music with a completely different fan base? In order to understand the bigger picture, we first need to explore the history of the original Screamo, how it rose to prominence, and how the popularity of a completely different genre ultimately led to its downfall and dilution, which in turn resulted in the need for an entirely new genre term coming in the form of Skramz. Although we may be getting a little bit too ahead of ourselves already. First of all, what the fuck is Screamo? And no, not this Screamo. What defined the original Screamo? Screamo typically utilizes frantic, chaotic instrumentals layered beneath desperate, screeched vocals. Sounds simple enough, although is far more complicated and manic when you begin to peel back the layers. Instrumentally, the music is schizophrenic as fuck, utilizing standard metal and punk techniques such as blast beats, tremolo picking, and distorted chords. Although these techniques are presented in a way that is unlike typical punk or metal, musical concepts and sounds are aggressively thrown in your general direction in an extremely chaotic manner, with each musical section within a song being incredibly short, powerful, and fast-paced before immediately switching tempos, rhythm, and harassing the audience with another aggressive, fast-paced section that differs drastically from the last. This is then contrasted by sections of introspection. The music suddenly switches emotions, utilizing slow-paced, powerful kick-heavy drums, soft guitars, and bass lines that you might typically see in post-punk or even trip-hop. Screamo then decides to jump scare the audience by immediately going back into intense, fast-paced drumming, distorted chords, and screeching without any prior warning. The way in which this style of music sounds and is played is a far cry from what the term Screamo came to be in the early 2000s, with the mainstream mall or pop Screamo essentially just being pop punk and mall emo with screaming, and eventually over time the term just came to define any piece of music that featured screaming. So how did the genre change to such a degree that the two styles are almost unrecognizable from each other? Well, in order to find that out, we first need to explore the origins of Screamo, how that then became diluted and gave birth to the entirely new term of Skramz. Screamo first popped its head out of the greasy underground depths in the 90s San Diego hardcore scene. The bands of the time were once again witnessing their genre and scene become commercialized through, God forbid, actually listenable music, with many of the scene's underground bands feeling as if hardcore and more importantly emo-core had lost much of its rawness that had made it appealing in the first place. One of these bands was the San Diego hardcore band Heroin, who somehow managed to increase the speed and intensity of the already present hardcore music, introducing intensely fast drumming and instrumentation, so much so that the songs were often extremely short to give the drummer a break. This was combined with a vocal style that would go on to inspire the term Screamo. Although hardcore and emo already utilized a vocal style that can be described as harsh, Heroin took it a little bit further, screeching out the punk-styled vocals in a sharp, gravelly, grating manner. This vocal style, alongside their fast-paced instrumentation, would separate the band from contemporaries of the time and begin to inspire a few others within the scene. Although Heroin are commonly considered to be the pioneers of Screamo, Iconoclast technically released their debut a few months beforehand, creating a similar frantic style of hardcore music with some really prominent bass sections that would eventually become an extremely appealing aspect of later Screamo music. Although early Screamo is typically recognized for the intense vocal style, these bands very clearly were able to innovate in terms of their instrumentals, and by this I don't mean forcing their drummer to play at 15 BPM above guaranteed tendinitis. I actually mean the usage of dissonance alongside octave chords, creating a sense of chaos that is both musically interesting and insanely fun to listen to for many members of the scene at the time. Despite the sudden chaotic emergence of a few Screamo pioneers, it had been clear for a decade or so the direction in which punk and hardcore music was heading. Every time a scene became too stagnant, a flurry of new interesting bands would push forwards the sound in one way or another. The example of this that's most prominent to Heroin in the Screamo scene they inspired is emocore, which was essentially just hardcore slowed down with a further focus on emotional and introspective lyricism. Traditionally, emocore vocals had been pretty clean, especially when comparing the genre to the later Screamo. Although early emocore vocals were relatively clean, it wouldn't be long until the style began to get more intense and, let's say, screechy. This became obvious with the formation of Mos Eisley in 1986, who were able to take what Rites of Spring and Embrace had done beforehand with the formation of emocore and push it forwards both instrumentally and sonically into a more avant-garde post-hardcore direction. By this I mean the lead singer of Mos Eisley particularly enjoyed screeching over insane instrumentals. Heroin was deeply inspired by this style of music, although primarily picked from the emotional vocal ingredients within the emocore stew. If anything, this early Screamo music was faster and more intense than the hardcore music emocore aimed to originally slow down. Heroin were joined by bands such as Antioch Arrow and Swing Kids, who would continue to develop upon the Screamo sound, with Antioch Arrow actually featuring a member originally within the band Heroin. Antioch Arrow would kickstart their brief career playing a style of music that would typically be considered post-hardcore, you know, Fugazi aficionados, although would begin to spice things up after releasing a few projects alongside the iconic early Screamo label Gravity Records. The band would introduce desperate, almost feral vocals alongside a visual style that was unique in the fact that every band member looked like a fucking neek. Yeah, that's right, the typical hardcore tough guy image didn't seem to reach San Diego in the 90s, with the earliest of Screamo bands looking more like a Rivers Cuomo Halloween costume than a Henry Rollins cosplay. The band that was most well known for donning this particular style was Swing Kids, with the frontman cutting his hair in a way that resembled Spock from Star Trek, all whilst screeching like a banshee on stage. Despite this aforementioned screeching, the term Screamo wasn't commonly used during this time frame, with the term Spock rock referring to the visual style of Swing Kids frontman Justin Pearson being the most commonly used term. Pearson's haircut and visual style would become so iconic that fans of the band began emulating the haircut, which in turn means at one point in the 90s, Spock was connected to a style of post-hardcore that utilized some of the most insane vocals alongside chaotic, almost schizophrenic rhythms and song structures. Believe it or not, the haircut of Pearson would actually go on to inspire many of the emo and scene styles that came to prominence in the early 2000s, and whether he meant it or not, Pearson, through this terrible haircut in the 90s, had accidentally connected the term Screamo to fucking this for years to come, although we will have to get back to that. The vast majority of the earliest bands would be signed to the independent label Gravity Records, formed in 1991 by Heroin member Matt Anderson. The label would be incredibly important in terms of the development of early Screamo, pushing forwards a style of post-hardcore that encouraged managed extremely chaotic, frantic music. This sound had become so appealing to the increasingly chaos-hungry young punks at the time that it began to spread outside of just San Diego, even reaching the complete opposite end of the country in the likes of New Jersey and eventually New York. How the fuck Screamo managed to travel the equivalent of a 3-hour flight is about as surprising to me as how big America is. A scene within New York that somewhat resembled the Screamo within San Diego had become particularly prominent by 1992, with the arts organization ABC No Rio giving a home to many of the burgeoning bands. ABC No Rio was a non-profit arts organization run out of a huge squat in the Lower East Side of New York. The space was typically utilized for art galleries, photography, and magazine production, although in the late 80s became home to the punk/hardcore collective. Starting in 1989, the space was utilized to hold weekly matinees, which is essentially just a daytime concert, with the performances slowly replacing the once iconic CBGB concerts that had been overtaken by racism, sexism, and homophobia by this point. This art collective turned concert venue would be extremely beneficial to the development of New York post-hardcore, as it allowed for many of the most frantic bands to play regularly to an audience of people open to new, extreme, and boundary-pushing sounds. New York had allowed punk and hardcore to grow into more extreme counterparts for years prior to this point, with bands like Agnostic Front and Cro-Mags demonstrating just that. And it was no different when it came to music that would inspire Screamo, with specifically the band Rorschach demonstrating a sound that can be seen as proto-Screamo effectively to a New York audience base. The Screamo sound would continue to spread, and by 1994 was pretty well defined and established within the underground. The scene reached pretty much every corner of the United States. If a location had a venue with something resembling a stage and enough degenerate kids to fill that venue, Screamo would eventually be played within that venue. Although it did begin to spread, it still remained entirely underground, with the genre being far too unhinged to receive any form of radio play or mainstream label attention outside of small, local, independent ventures. It seemed perfect, only in punk, nothing is perfect. If something is extreme, 2 years later, it will be boring, and some freakazoid in a weird hoodie chuffing down cigarettes will decide to push the boundaries even further, with this eventually becoming the fate for Screamo within Columbia, South Carolina. The sound had slowly been mutating in the underground into a faster, louder, and more schizophrenic Screamo counterpart, with no band portraying this more than Inhumanity. Inhumanity would form in 1991, subsequently releasing their debut 7-inch named Intolerable. They would produce 500 copies and decided it was only fitting to completely obliterate 275 of the copies by scratching the f out of them with a compass and throwing them towards crowd members at concerts. The sound of the music was actually able to coincide with the chaos of attempting to dodge multiple 7-inches at a show. The emotional outbursts and vocal style of Screamo was combined with the fast-paced aggressive nature of Power Violence, with Power Violence essentially just being hardcore with everything pushed up to 11, and by this I mean an underproduced, heinously raw 300 BPM piece of punk music that changes tempos every bar and only lasts about 5 seconds. So yeah, you can probably imagine what emo violence sounds like based on that. Despite the term emo violence seeing prominent usage today, the original creators absolutely hated it, originally utilizing it as a joke. They saw the genre labels of Screamo and Power Violence as equally and began utilizing emo violence as a tongue-in-cheek reaction against consistent genre labeling. Screamo continued to bubble to the surface of underground culture throughout the United States, with the Virginia band Page 99 becoming one of the most influential bands within the scene when it comes to inspiring the modern sound. So how did they do this? Did they speed up the music, add more tempo changes? How on earth did they make Screamo more extreme? Well, it's simple really. They just added more members to guarantee as much noise as possible. At their peak, the band featured 2 singers, 4 guitarists, 2 bassists, and 1 singular drummer, all playing a relentless style of Screamo that remained consistently interesting through constant changes in tempo and emotion. The band was truly ferocious and effectively utilized elements from both emo and hardcore punk, contrasting blistering sections of speed and aggression with slower, more calm sections focused on introspection. They would eventually break up in 2003 due due to issues regarding alcohol consumption and an inability to organize a band with so many members. During the late 90s, Screamo became intrinsically linked with other post-hardcore genres such as metalcore, with the conventions melding somewhat, making it difficult to define and differentiate between Screamo, metalcore, or emo violence. It all formed just one big bubbling stew. Despite this, various bands would begin pushing the sound into a direction that would remain unique to Screamo for years to come. Saetia would form within New York in 1997, and despite hailing from the same city as bands that somewhat fit into early Screamo such as Rorschach, they became enthralled by the sounds produced by Gravity Records, a label that specialized in the original San Diego Screamo sound, boasting bands like Heroin and Antioch Arrow. They clearly had a knack for the more emotional side of early hardcore music, which just so happened to combine with the DIY aspects of New York punk and hardcore to create a style that would alter the direction of Screamo forever. The release of Saetia's self-titled album in 1998 had finally put a stamp on what Screamo actually was. If Heroin had given birth to Screamo, Saetia had perfected it, utilizing calmer spoken word sections and consistently jump-scaring the listener by randomly breaking into chaotic walls of guitar and drums, accompanied by shrieks and wails that made the Screamo of the past look tame by comparison. Just north of New York in Massachusetts, Screamo continued to develop, although differed from Saetia in terms of its sheer intensity, often choosing to completely ditch the calm introspection and swap it with consistently evolving fast-paced noise. The band within this scene that became most prominent was Orchid, although if you were to watch them live during their early years, you wouldn't imagine them becoming one of the most celebrated artists within Screamo and emo violence. This is because, much like many Screamo and emo bands in the past, the band started their career playing pretty typical hardcore music. Although kids were attending the shows, the band that initially met whilst attending Hampshire College had a thirst for something more, and it just so happened that this thirst was for extremely frantic, chaotic music that truly took emo violence from a term primarily utilized as a joke to literally the only suitable word to describe the style of music. The release of Chaos Is Me in 1999 truly put a stamp on this new style of Screamo music. They combined emo, Screamo, and post-hardcore, whilst sprinkling a healthy serving of power violence and grindcore, creating something that would likely permanently send a schizophrenic over the edge after just 1 minute of listening, which is convenient since most songs last about 1 minute. The album constantly throws distorted audio data directly into your eardrums. Blast beats, tremolo picking, high-pitched shrieks, and sheer distortion is thrown together in a way that's somehow constantly evolving and changing, sending you down different paths of noise that all differ from each other, although are somehow combined effectively into just one short song. Orchid, specifically with their 2000 album Dance Tonight, Revolution Tomorrow, would become one of the most celebrated artists within Screamo and emo violence, creating a blueprint that bands continue to follow in the modern day. By this point, Screamo seemed like a healthy secular subculture and scene. There was no longer confusion onto what Screamo actually was. Bands had successfully developed and contributed to the sound, allowing Screamo to be a genre unique to a specific, distinct and exciting sound that was bound to continue to develop in the underground. There was just one problem, however, a problem that no hardcore kid could have seen coming. It was the turn of the millennium, which means just one thing. Emo and post-hardcore subcultures as a whole were about to be torn, stretched and molded into something completely different, all thanks to mainstream attention. There's a reason the first thought that comes to your mind when hearing the word Screamo is more akin to this than an underground scene of post-hardcore freakazoids trying to confuse the brain of their audience members into early onset dementia. The term in the 2000s very quickly came to mean something entirely different, with this degradation of the Screamo term first seeing roots in 1995 when journalists got their filthy little mitts on the genre and began using it to describe any band that utilized screaming, specifically bands that fit into the emo scene that was beginning to bubble towards the mainstream. You see, this emo scene was very different from the emo core and post-hardcore of the past. The new bands barely resembled Rites of Spring, Embrace or Moss Icon in terms of visual style, and more importantly the audio content of their music. This all begins to make sense when exploring the rapid changes that were happening to pretty much every post-hardcore genre, such as emocore. Whilst Screamo was developing into a schizophrenic dream/nightmare, emocore was also going through various developments at the same time. Midwest emo had begun to bubble in the underground, introducing poppier and more complicated riffs into the music and developing a vibe that differed greatly from the emo core of the past. Bands like the Promise Ring and Jimmy Eat World were at the forefront of this and began introducing an element to hardcore that the genre hadn't really seen before: pop sensibilities. The development of hardcore and emo into a more mainstream friendly sound, alongside the consequences of the grunge explosion and Nirvana's monumental success, primed emo for a similar mainstream explosion. And when anything becomes mainstream, you best believe the product will be diluted in order to pump as much money out of it as possible before it's thrown to the side when another new exciting music subculture inevitably presents itself. In order to effectively understand how emo becoming mainstream affected Screamo, we need to go back in time a little bit, to a time that's perhaps more terrifying than the late Cretaceous. It was the summer of 2002. Jimmy Eat World's album Bleed
American
had gone platinum, with the song The Middle being very difficult to avoid in public. The song was routinely played in locations ranging from airports to shopping malls. These same shopping malls were beginning to become overrun with stylized shops, selling a style of dress that only a few years ago was frowned upon and only utilized within specific underground subcultures. These shops had become incredibly popular and attracted a very specific individual: thick-rimmed glasses, black clothing utilized in subcultures ranging from goth to hardcore, and a haircut that looked like a more extreme version of the early San Diego Screamo Spock style. In just under 15 years, a style that was originally subject to community centers you wouldn't dare to enter unless you wanted to get spin kicked in the dome had become as normal as a suit and tie in a business park. You'd imagine, due to the fact that this style was directly inspired by San Diego Screamo, that the genre of music was thriving within the mainstream, but that just simply wasn't the case. Original Screamo remained largely unchanged, attracting the same group of people and still residing entirely within the underground. So what were these hot topic obsessed freaks actually listening to? If you were to take a time machine back to 2002 and ask a typical emo what genres they enjoyed, it's likely they would respond with emo and Screamo, despite being entirely unaware of who Orchid or even Rites of Spring were. This can be explained by the slow degradation of the Screamo term that saw most prominence in the turn of the millennium. This saw record labels and music journalists take the catchy term and slowly mold it into an inoffensive sludge, primed and ready to be used for whatever music they saw fit, so they could take advantage of the now mainstream emo subculture for a little bit of that cheddar. This slow morph of the Screamo definition into something entirely different would truly begin in the late 90s. It was no longer frowned upon to insert pop elements into hardcore music, which saw many bands influenced by the post-hardcore of the past becoming much more melodic and introspective than they had done before. A key example of this is the melodic hardcore band Thursday, who would begin playing a much more subdued and mainstream friendly version of post-hardcore, which saw huge amounts of success and attention in the early 2000s, resulting in the band actually seeing Billboard recognition and receiving attention from mainstream record labels. But what does this have to do with Screamo? Well, it just so happened that the frontman of Thursday would occasionally scream, and actually used a screeching style that somewhat resembled the Screamo from the past, although much more subdued. Due to this vocal style, Thursday began receiving the label of Screamo by media and record labels, despite the band actually disavowing the term and preferring melodic hardcore. The reason for this is clear. Emo was already seeing insane global attention. Screamo sounds very similar to emo. It's a no-brainer to use the easily recognizable term to market the same brand of music to people who just so happen to enjoy a bit of screaming in their songs. Before too long, more melodic hardcore bands began receiving the same label. Alex is on Fire, Silverstein, The Used. All these bands were now considered Screamo in the eyes of many mainstream music listeners, although differed considerably from what Screamo originally was. Instead of being completely DIY and experimental, these bands stuck to a mainstream friendly formula and received large amounts of funding from labels through multi-album deals. And although the original Screamo scene was still flourishing and seeing development in the underground through bands like City of Caterpillar, they were dwarfed by the mainstream quote-unquote Screamo bands in terms of size, resources and popularity, which slowly but surely completely changed Screamo's definition for the vast majority of music fans. Screamo was now just any piece of music that featured screaming, and the term was utilized to market a style of dress that benefited heavily from commercialization and capitalism. The underground scene, of course, reacted negatively to this and created a new genre name to combat the degradation creation of the Screamo label. This new genre name would be Skramz, jokingly coined by Alex Bigman of the band Seeing Means More. Although originally just a joke, Skramz slowly but surely became the most common term used to describe the music by individuals within the local scenes and online fans all over the world. It became synonymous with frantic, chaotic instrumentals layered beneath shrieked vocals throughout the 2000s and early 2010s, as Screamo continued to worsen its reputation within the mainstream with this. The mainstream dominance of Screamo wouldn't last, however, and much like every underground genre that gets thrust into the mainstream before being flipped over and shaked by extremely buff men in tight suits until every penny and piece of gum is dropped to the floor, the audience began to lose interest, and as soon as the audience loses interest, you best believe the record labels will drop the genre as quick as they originally injected it with money and assets. Luckily for Screamo, the underground scene had never really died and continued to trudge forwards alongside other hardcore adjacent genres, leaving it primed and ready for the always iconic 2010s revival. Similar to pretty much every underground scene that rose to prominence in the 90s, Screamo saw a decent 2010s revival, with bands like La Dispute, Touche Amore, Death Eater, and Death Heaven all having certain attributes within their music that was clearly inspired by first wave Screamo. Although each of these bands individually fit into different genres and styles, their ethos and message was truly DIY and fit into the original Screamo vibe more comfortably than mainstream pop punk attempting to squeeze itself into Screamo jeans that are 4 sizes too small. And that brings us to a screeching halt within the modern day, where it seems the style of original first wave Screamo is as popular as it's ever been. It's reached the point where it's rare to even see confusion in regards to what Screamo actually is, with most online discussion correctly attributing the sound of Screamo to the sound that saw its birth in the San Diego scene. Nowadays, Skramz and Screamo are used interchangeably, with Skramz just being the term to use if you're either terminally online, run a Screamo meme page, or look like this, most of the time all three. Screamo is still occasionally used to describe the poppier side of the genre that saw its rise in the early 2000s, especially by fans who were actively within the scene and enjoyed the style of music at the time, although clear differentiation is obvious depending on the context of the conversation. So how exactly has this resurgence in popularity happened? Screamo now sees prominent discussion online, with local scenes and shows seeing huge amounts of attention and a constant flow of new faces. Older bands such as Page 99 and Saetia are seeing reunion tours sell out in seconds. Newer bands such as Betrayal of Guilt and Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead are receiving heavy recognition, and online Screamo posts and memes are becoming as plentiful as contemporary more popular genres such as Midwest emo or hardcore. I really hate to do this, but the answer is once again, unfortunately, TikTok. Yes, time and time again, Chinese spyware is somehow responsible for a huge injection of resurgence of popularity into an underground genre. Much like nu metal, Midwest emo, shoegaze, and hardcore, TikTok allowed for the already present underground scenes of Skramz to be presented to the entire world through perhaps the most effective social media in terms of getting people addicted and causing severe brain rot. Young people devoid of any in-person socialization or sense of belonging are presented a style of music and culture that has ethos, community, and ethics inherently attached due to its early connection with hardcore. This then encourages the brain rottee to explore the music that is presented within the posts and memes, with the music of Skramz just so happening to be the literal perfect embodiment of brain rot in audio form. The short songs alongside constant tempo and section changes tickles the brainstem of the brain rottee, which in time injects some much needed youth interest into the underground scene. This injection of youth attention into local Screamo scenes became obvious when Versus Self absolutely exploded to the forefront of the underground through various viral songs on TikTok. Despite the fact the band dips their toes into various musical styles such as Midwest emo, vocally they are unapologetically Screamo and became one of the most popular underground bands through the social media fueled success of that one song with a really long dumb name. Versus Self recently got announced to play Coachella, and despite the monumental success, still stay true to the scene, consistently giving back to the genre of Skramz. The success and positive attitude of Versus Self has benefited the genre and scene greatly. Kids are going to the shows off the back of the viral song, and instead of just holding up their phones or DSs to try and take a video of Versus Self, they are presented with other smaller bands within the scene through support acts. Although Skramz has heavy competition in the online music landscape, it's inherently inherent traits will always allow it to separate itself from the more popular contemporary genres. Despite the fact that Skramz can and will be batshit insane, it focuses its sound heavily on introspection and emotional depth. The lyrics are often poetic, with a vocal style reflecting vulnerable emotion that contrasts with the often masculine and aggressive style of hardcore and metal. It creates a space for the nerdy, baggy t-shirt wearer, equally obsessed with Charles Bukowski as they are early power violence. This all seems extremely positive, although there is always a looming problem. As common when any underground scene sees a sudden influx in attention, there is a risk of the scene being watered down as newcomers who may not understand or just want to use the style of music as an aesthetic or unique personality trait enter the scene. Although this can very often be seen in some shows and local scenes as main character syndrome becomes an epidemic, I do see only positive things for the future of Skramz. The music is often insane enough to naturally gatekeep it away from people who may inherently damage the scene, and more money, attention, and bands have resulted in some of the best projects being released in the modern day fitting into the Screamo or emo violence label, a genre that in 30 years has transformed from hardcore's emotionally unstable younger brother to a label damaged and misunderstood as a result of mainstream meddling to the modern subculture underdog screeching and wailing its way through underground music. The story of Screamo clearly presents various problems in terms of the utilization of genres to describe particular types of music. Although I do believe these terms are consistently useful and almost necessary in order to present listeners to the sounds they enjoy and advertise concerts and bands, a genre's ability to very quickly morph in definitions poses problems to the more underground scenes. The original Screamo scene lost its identity due to mainstream meddling, and due to this, there are still misunderstandings around what the genre means to this very day. It can be argued that the internet may slowly solve this conundrum as it has with Screamo and Skramz, as the availability of information allows fans to explore genre histories and definitions much easier, although it's clear this isn't the case when exploring similar situations like in the case of breakcore. In a very short time, breakcore transformed from robots passionately f***ing within a room full of screws and nails to just ambient drum and bass and jungle, all through the internet misunderstanding the genre's history and attributing the term to a more mainstream friendly and appealing style of music. It brings into question the need for genres in the first place. Musicians clearly don't care and will just make music based on their influences and passions, although it becomes difficult when these same musicians attempt to market these albums towards people who are likely to enjoy their art. It is clear there is little that can be done to change this. Genres are almost necessary to make the art form financially viable. Music needs to be put into specific sections to reach the ears of more people. Genres allow people to join scenes they are passionate about, support bands through merchandise, and find more underground music they are likely to enjoy. And I get it, before half of you punk, hardcore, or crust purists try to comment how music shouldn't be made in the pursuit of money, I can guarantee deep down every musician would rather be sufficiently paid for their art as opposed to serving NPCs and crackhead cigarettes at gas stations so they can buy more patches, band merch, and guitar pedals that will 100% lead them to achieve the perfect tone after 15 years of trying.